Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, and sometimes in between, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to academic.oup.com/bioscience. For today's episode, we have a show on a topic that's a little bit different from some of our others. I was joined by Dr. Paolo D'Odorico of the University of California, Berkley. He was here to talk about his recent article on food inequality, particularly among humans, and the consideration of food access as a fundamental human right. We also talked a lot about trade and its implications for food access and inequality, among quite a few other things, but let's let him explain. Paolo, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, to start with, I was hoping we could talk a little bit about sort of the concept of food access as a human right. The idea obviously seems very natural to us, but where did it come from originally? And, is it enshrined in international law and policy, that kind of thing?
Well, the international community through the United Nations has recognized the right to food as a human right in 1948. And that is the time when the UN signed this Declaration on Human Rights. It included the right to food and many other human rights.
Okay, and so from there, it's been something that's recognized that governments have an obligation to ensure that their citizens are able to get the necessary number of calories.
Yes, exactly. There was after that there was in 1966 the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that stated that every state has the obligation to ensure that all people have access to a minimum amount of food that is nutritionally adequate and safe.
And why is that such a pressing issue right now? Is it a climate change thing, or is this just a function of growing populations, trade? What are some of the driving factors that make this something that's particularly important at this moment?
Well, there have always been, in the last few decades, a part of the human population was undernourished, and has been estimated around 800 million people, maybe more. And the reason why we talk more about that in recent years, in my view, is because we had some recent food crisis. And so the issue of feeding the planet and feeding the world has come back as a resurfaced as one of the important issues that humanity needs to face. And right after World War II, on the wake of the Green Revolution, there were unprecedented growths in the amount and capacity to produce food. And now, in recent years, we saw some. In the meantime, global population has grown, and we have seen some food crisis in 2008, 2011. So there has been also in the scientific community an impetus in studying food security, global food security, and what affects global food security. And clearly, then there is the issue of looking at food as a human right, and a human right as a right that belongs to every human being.
Okay, and I was hoping we could chat just a little bit more about the types of rights that you lay out. You describe them as positive and negative rights in the article. Could you tell us a little bit about those concepts and how they apply here?
Yeah, I thought that this framework of the negative and the positive rights was useful to lead our thoughts and our analysis of food security, because basically there is a big difference within the class of human rights between rights that require inaction. So this could be all the civil liberties, the liberty to freedom, to dignity, to life. They require that nobody else breaks or interferes with the individual's enjoyment of these rights. And then there are other rights which are defined as positive rights. They require many times they require some action. And these are rights like the right to education, the right to food. This requires that basically something needs to be done for the person to enjoy these rights. So in the paper I make the example of the right to education. It means that the family, the community needs to provide some resources for the child to go to school. And In the same way, the right to food is viewed as a positive right because it requires that something needs to be done in case there is no direct access to enough food to be free from hunger.
So in that case, there would be an onus on some sort of governmental or international governmental body to ensure that the minimums were met.
Yes. At the same time, that's sometimes also considered as one of the criteria to evaluate whether a government is a failing government or is a good government, in the sense that if human rights are not fulfilled, that's an indication of the fact that the government is missing on an important responsibility. The other thing that the UN clarifies is that the right to be free from hunger doesn't necessarily mean that the state needs to provide the food. The state first needs to provide the conditions that are favorable and that allow people to provide food for themselves.
Okay, and that would be sort of describing the negative right insofar as the government isn't interfering with people's ability to acquire food.
Yes, or also in providing conditions that then allow for the establishment of a food system that allows individuals to provide food for themselves.
Okay, and you mentioned the classification of failing states. And, I was wondering, is that, and are there other applications where, having this rights-based framework for food security helps us do the right thing and, apply the right standards to nations to ensure that they're doing and behaving as they should with regard to their citizens' rights to food access?
Yes, I think what is useful in this classification between positive and negative rights is really that they allow us to identify also some agenda items for governments in a way that is not sufficient to say, okay, certain rights are not met, but it means that something needs to be done for the enjoyment of those rights. In particular, in the case of positive rights, overall, the issue becomes to providing resources to make it happen. And so that's a big difference between the positive and the negative rights, is that the next question is whether these resources exist and whether these resources are distributed in a way that it's possible for every human being to enjoy these rights. Again, human rights are rights that an individual has just by the fact of being a human being. And so are rights that cannot be given away and they belong to the individual. And so I think the important thing here is to see that whether the distribution of resources is there is a distribution of resources that allows for the enjoyment of these rights.
Okay, and that gets to a question that that I always wonder about is how do you figure that sort of thing out? Where are the data, and what data do you look at in trying to analyze this thing? Which I guess gets to the heart of sort of your own analysis. What informed it, and how is it undertaken?
Yeah, the problem we have in this type of analysis is that we don't have data that tell us exactly the access to food for individual human beings. So we have average country statistics, so we know that how food production and food availability is distributed among countries. And so we can do a country scale type of analysis and look at inequalities among countries. Then there is a whole problem of within country inequality that we are only indirectly able to address in our manuscript. And that's done mostly by looking at wealth distribution within countries and the cost of food within countries.
Okay, so the analysis begins, though, at the between country level, in which you look at the amount of food that countries are able to produce on their own, and then the amount that they're able to get through trade as well?
Exactly. And so in this way, we can look indirectly whether trade improves or not the availability of food, whether trade acts in the direction of improving, and so reducing the fraction of population that is not free from hunger.
Okay, and what did your analysis show? This is something that I think will be interesting for our listeners because, there's often a lot of political opinion bandied about the effects of trade and whether it's deleterious or helpful for certain populations. And so it's very nice to have this sort of actual analytical approach to it. What did you find?
So what we find is that trade tends to reduce inequality in food availability between countries. So that's an interesting finding. So overall, trade tends to bring food from country rich to country poor, between food rich and the food poor countries. And this clearly is on average. This doesn't mean that trade acts exactly in the direction of eradicating malnourishment. Because, again, these are country-based, country averages. But the interesting thing is that overall, for the 2.5 decades we have analyzed, trade reduces global inequality in food availability.
And is this just a function of mostly countries that are less able to produce, that don't have the agricultural capacity or otherwise are able to buy food on the market or receive it as some sort of aid?
So what we see is that trade has the effect of transferring food from countries that have a higher capacity to produce food to countries that have less capacity to produce food on average. And if we look at the inequality in the biophysical endowments, and with this we refer to the capacity to produce food in each country, and we have been looking just at the agricultural land, the land suitable for agriculture, and the maximum yields that can be attained in different areas of the world, we see that the inequality is much bigger, which means that by itself, even the patterns of economic development of agriculture have tried to offset a little bit this inequality. And in addition to that, trade reduces that inequality even further. So if you look just by looking at this data analysis, we would tend to think that trade tends to reduce inequality. At the same time, in the article, we try to stress the fact that trade can be also the cause partly of this inequality, because the global patterns of economic development have often acted in the direction of impeding some country to develop a strong agriculture, because the local businesses have been sometimes displaced by imports of food from other parts of the world at a lower price. And that food was often available at a lower price in the international market because of subsidies existing in the major food exporting countries.
Okay, and I hope you won't mind if I take a shot at, an example of that. But in the U.S., we talk a lot about corn subsidies and the fact that the U.S. government subsidizes the price of corn, artificially lowering it, and that may make it less valuable or less useful for a country that's less agriculturally productive to bother producing corn because it's hard to beat the U.S. price.
It's exactly like that, and corn is a good example, in fact. So it's a subsidized crop, and the export of this crop can really outcompete local businesses and local producers.
Okay, so this is a case in which, even as we acknowledge the broad trend that trade seems to help with food inequality, we have to acknowledge that there may be lurking beneath the surface some local effects that run contrary to that broader theme.
Exactly. I think the problem is that some of the trade dependencies have been self-sustained by trade itself.
And how does that process work?
Exactly as you said, because if reliance on trade impedes the development of a local economy or a local agricultural production, or limits or jeopardizes some of the local production because of the competitive prices of imports, then this can create, in the long run, a condition of dependency on imports for the import-dependent countries. And this can be also a problem because what has been observed in the recent food crisis is that when prices when there is a food shortage and prices go up, some of the exporting countries can even reduce their exports, and then through export bans, so they can reduce their exports, and then the trade or import dependent countries can be left with a more limited supply of food.
So it would be only a superficial understanding of your article to say that, trade is a universal good, because you also have effects that can be contrarian as well, and those need to be looked at.
Definitely. And that was the reason why we try to stress some of these points. It would be very superficial otherwise to think that trade is has only positive implications. Of course, in the short term, there are some advantages to these global transfers and globalization of food, because a local food shortage can be compensated through food imports. But in the long run, this creates conditions of trade dependency that can be also, as I said, self-sustained. And so there are all these aspects that need to be accounted for.
Okay, that's fascinating. And I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, which was inequality within countries, because obviously that's quite the issue. In any country, regardless of its overall, status of per capita calories, you're going to have an enormous amount of inequality within. Were you able to look at that as well?
Only indirectly. So we have been looking at the income of the poor, so of the lowest fraction of the population. So we looked at the lowest 20% in each country, and we looked at how that income compares with the cost of food in each country, just to have a sense of the extent to which the poor can be left with no economic access to food. And this, however, we have been unable to really go down to the scale of the individual and really verify the impact of inequality or changes also inequality within country on food security in each country.
Okay, that's interesting as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the broad trends? You mentioned that this was a study of an over 25-year time period. Are there trends that we see? Is food inequality becoming more of a problem or less of a problem?
Well, the inequality between countries remains about constant. And without going to the details on how this is quantified, usually we use this Gini coefficient, which is an index that varies between 0 and 1, and remains at 0.2 throughout the period, with 0 being the complete equality. And so even though there's been an increase in global trade and an increase in global population overall, and also an increase in food production, the inequality has remained about constant.
And I'm wondering now if you'd like to tell us a little bit about what kind of questions should we be looking at in the future? Are there research questions that you hope to explore in your own work, or research questions that you hope are explored by others that might give us even greater insight into food inequality and how to ensure that the rights of the world's people are met appropriately?
Well, I think one important contribution of this paper is really this linkage between inequality and human rights, in the sense that having inequality doesn't necessarily mean that some human rights are violated. And now we are focusing on the human right to food, which is a positive right. And now we know that a positive right requires some resources to be allocated for the enjoyment of that right. So if there are enough resources in the world, and there are still some people who are not able to enjoy a positive right like the right to food, this means that the distribution of these resources, which is basically also inequality, is contributing to the violation of positive rights. And so I think the main contribution of this study is to connect the dots between the notion of human rights and the notion of inequalities. Now that we have established the relationship existing between human rights and inequalities, we can look at distribution of resources and also distribution of wealth from this angle, and determine to what extent inequality is contributing to a violation of human rights, such as the right to food. And so we can then expand this in other direction. And one of them would be in the direction of water. And the reason why there is an interest in the distribution of water is that water is a natural resource. And there is a lot of interest in whether water should be priced and commodified, or whether water is a human right. And when I talk about water as a human right, I refer to water for food production, not to drinking water, because the water used for food production is the majority. And so I think this discussion on the distribution of water resources and access to water resources can be strongly informed by an analysis of that is based on the analysis of the human rights to food.
And so an article such as yours really does give us a useful tool for viewing things through that lens.
I hope so.
Paolo, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.